Good morning, everyone. Happy International Peace Day. And I am very, very humbled to be today with a session which is truly international. We have people from all over the world: Japan, Germany, South Africa, Finland, Israel, Ukraine, United States. So it's truly international panel, and everyone who is presenting today, I will introduce person by person, but everyone who is presenting here is somebody who devoted all life who is to reconciliation studies. Every single presenter today is extremely well known, world leading expert on reconciliation, on particular area of reconciliation studies. And it's really, we expect this panel to be a really good conversation. So what we will be asking first to presenters each presenter will present, and then we'll open for question and answers. I'm very glad that we have today wonderful facilitator, Mike Sugart, who is actually also devoted a lot of years of working in Balkans. He done a lot of work in National Democratic Institute and have years of experience working on multiple grants and projects related to post-conflict reconstruction, reconciliation. So he will be our facilitator for our discussion today. Very, very pleased to have him here. So, and we'll start today. Again, thank you very much for everyone, because for Toyomi it's 10 p.m. in Japan, but it's wonderful. Yes, it's wonderful to have everyone here. And looking forward to great conversations. Let's start with Martian. Martian Leiner is theologist by his background, but he worked for peace and reconciliation for years. He authored multiple books, and he started, his founding father of the Indigenous Center for Reconciliation Studies, where he led multiple projects with Palestinian youth, with people from Middle East. He wrote one of the book on South America. So he really truly international scholar who studied reconciliation, and specifically also religious reconciliation. Martin, please. Martin, we could not hear you.
To switch it on.
Oh, yeah.
So it is now good?
Yes, please.
So good morning, good day, good evening. I have a PowerPoint and I must load it up. Just here it is. And I want to talk about reconciliation studies. Does it function? Do you see the PowerPoint?
Yes. Yeah.
So reconciliation studies in general, and as well about religion and reconciliation. So reconciliation studies, I propose the following definition: that is a scholarly description, interpretation, and evaluation of processes of creating normal and, if possible, good relationships. So it's a definition which is very much based on relationships, and it's as well, you find between brackets normal and good. This means normal and good according to what the people concerned are considering as normal and good. And it's between whom this relationships is between states, groups, organizations, and individuals. And it's on the background of past, present, or preventing future grave incidents which are damaging the relationships, such as wars, civil wars, genocides, atrocities, forced displacement, enslavement, dictatorship, oppression, colonialism, apartheid, and other human rights violations and injustices. This is a definition we are working with in Jena, and we are aware that there is a certain enlargement and extension in one observation, that you are not always living just in one relationship, But if you have a relationship to somebody else, you have in the same time, you deal with your relationship to yourself and to your own group, to the environment, and also to what you call transcendence, which means what you are believing in, your values, your sense in life, God, your religion. And this is always affected. And the other you have a relationship with is also not homogeneous. The other can be an individual within a group, within a state, which has maybe multiple identities, and all this makes the whole process quite differentiated, with a lot of chances, but also with a lot of things to address. And in most cases, those are so multifaceted long-term processes, including many steps and involving very different activities. And to work on those processes, we need a transdisciplinary approach to explain why processes succeed or fail. So it's clear that we cannot just use one discipline, and a process has so many elements. It's not only by psychology or only by political science or by history or by religion that you will understand those processes. It can fail in media or in economy, for example. And the strength of this new association we have founded in August together with Karina and Toyomi and also many others who are present today is that there are colleagues from so many disciplines working together. And this is so the new dream and goal that we want to go ahead with reconciliation studies in a very much interdisciplinary way. And I see a special task for reconciliation studies in the near future to establish reconciliation in each discipline as an important topic by doing high quality research. This is something I would like to foster and to work with, also with our doctoral students, and to get a good reputation for this research and showing also the added value of reconciliation in relationship to other more traditional concepts we have, like conflict resolution, or even newer like conflict transformation and peace studies, so that reconciliation brings something special in. And we have also to clarify the cooperation and relationship to neighboring and overlapping scientific projects, such as transitional justice or conflict resolution, conflict transformation, mediation, peace studies. To elaborate methodology for transdisciplinary cooperation. Transdisciplinary means that you are not just exchanging results at the border of disciplines, but that you try to understand the other disciplines, how they work, how their methodology is, and what they can find out and where are their limitations, because every discipline has its limits. So we need to study epistemology and philosophy. To cooperate for us with other transdisciplinary projects such as refugee studies. Refugees are often in need of reconciliation. Heritage studies, there are a lot of conflicts on heritage, memory studies, post-colonial studies, and others which can make very interesting concrete projects. And of course, to have practical results which are interesting and which can consult governments, NGOs, and help communities. So to gather experiences with reconciliation around the world, traditions and resources for reconciliation, and bring them together to have a set of knowledge, what can be useful for reconciliation in new situations we have to face. And now I want to talk just briefly about one of the topics which are especially mine, or I worked on, because I'm a professor of theology by training. And so it's religions and reconciliation. There has been the discovery since the 90s and the last 2 decades that religions are resources for reconciliation, and they are not so much to be seen like before, that they are more or less obstacles or actors for violence and unresolvable identity conflicts. There is a spirituality of reconciliation as a common experience which can lead together people such as the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu, for example, who wrote a book together and who are friends. So this is creating new experiences, and the theory of religion and its relationship to reconciliation will also be a point I want to talk about. So first of all, the discovery of religions as resource for reconciliation. 20 years ago, we had the impression that religions are a source of violence. You have only to see some countries and religions starting with I, and you think of conflicts and you have religion in it. Islam, Ireland, India, Indonesia, Iran, Iraq, Israel. So everywhere you have conflicts with religion, but also in many other countries around the world. And there are as well theoretical concepts built on this religious side of violence, like sectarianism, ambivalence of the sacred, violence as service to God, or the ambivalence of the sacred, intolerance of monotheistic religions, murderous religious identities. Those were concepts and books very much developed about 20 years ago and a bit later. And the keywords were blasphemia, martyrdom, dualistic worldview, apocalyptic imaginations, theocratic, fundamentalism, fanatism. And the answer seems for many people secularism, laicity, citizenship, enlightenment, multiple identities. And the typical image, still in 2013, the rise of religious hostilities. The countries in red are countries where there is a strong rise in religious hostilities in this year. But we had also the discoveries that there are religious violence is a multifactorial phenomenon. They are dependent on how state and religion are overlapping, how their relationship is seen and lived. Poverty might play a role, a lack of religious freedom. There's often a reactive character of religious violence, for example, against the westernization of countries where the traditionally religious culture is threatened in post-modernity. There are also instrumentalist interpretations, so religions as identity markers, social problems, which are picked up by religion, or religion are talking for the people who are exploited and live in poverty. Religious critique of violence is now often an answer against this violence, where, for example, Islamic sheikhs say this is not Islam, then people are using Islam to legitimate violence and so on. And this became more and more important, and there were a lot of examples of peaceful religions, traditions in religions, many actors for peace, also celebrities with Mahatma Gandhi, Pope John Paul II, Desmond Tutu, Dalai Lama, Thich Nhat Hanh, Ima Kwobi. They are all religious leaders, and there are many others who are very much motivated by religion to work for peace since many years. Religious organizations are working for peace, and they have also religious activism for peace and local and global infrastructures for peace and peace trainings. all this is very much done by religions. And the question is why they are so important partners for reconciliation. This is because they are often trusted, they are locally rooted, they can create sustainable change because they stay in the place, not just like people who come in for making a project and then go out. They are influential, committed, and often internationally connected. So research questions with practical results might be, which are the peaceful traditions in each religion and how can they be activated? How can violent traditions be overcome? How to describe main cases of religious activities for reconciliation? What are best practices of religious work for reconciliation? Why problems are currently met in religious activities for reconciliation, and how cooperation between different religions and between religions and non-religious actors, including states, also secular states, are possible. And there is a new observation that reconciliation is a word that is used as an important term by representative of many, maybe all bigger religions. And this shows that there is a spirituality of reconciliation now growing around the world. How this is to explain, it seems that reconciliation is a trans-religious spiritual experience made within different religions. It includes experiences of interconnectedness or interbeing, as the Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh is saying, or Ubuntu, or the Jewish Martin Buber, das Zwischen, the Between. There are experiences of forgiveness, of empathy, compassion, experiences of brotherhood and sisterhood, but more precisely, also the 5 dimensions of reconciliation. I talked about reconciliation with myself, my past, my mistakes, my limits in life, unchangeable losses, death, and so on, with others in groups, with the own group and the environment. This all is connected as well with reconciliation with God or my sense of life, my values. And it's always playing a role in reconciliation processes. And it seems in all this, as the Swiss psychiatrist Daniel Hell, he is somehow the successor of Carl Gustav Jung in Zurich in the Burghölzli Hospital. He said reconciliation with oneself is now the most important and the most difficult for modern man today. And it is as if this reconciliation, religious ideas of judgment after life has been strongly internalized. Many people are judging themselves like the worst judges would not do, and even the worst God would not judge in the eternal life. Everyday life is often accusation because of not very important mistakes. But there are also deeper problems such as non-repairable guilt, limits of life, not repairable losses, remorse, regret. And the problem is of finding oneself always again as oneself, becoming identical and resonant with one's life again. Activities such as singing, dancing, celebrating together, rituals, confessions, and dialogues with friends, in public or with priests, become important again for reconciliation with oneself. People discover the interdependence of the 5 dimensions of reconciliation and understand that the 5th dimension, reconciliation with transcendence, is important. It helps also to deal with what cannot be repaired or changed. And then the 3rd point, religion, the theory of religion and its relationship to reconciliation. There might be a claim which can be discussed whether reconciliation is maybe the topic of every religion somehow. Every religion leads to some reconciliation, to some reconnection with the world, with the other, with transcendence after failure, after transgressions. And this is at least a very important point in many religions. And so there are people who can develop this idea which can go back in philosophy to Hegel, to the philosopher who was born 250 years ago in Germany this year, and that religion is about reconciliation in general. And reconciliation theory can also learn from other religions, not only by a westernized tradition or secular thinking, I think. And reconciliation needs as well mourning. In Rwanda, you have this month of mourning in April every year, the Kwibuka, where it's remembering and also mourning of which cannot be repaired and which people must deal in different way than by, for example, legal attempts of reparation. The peace of God, which passes all understanding, which is said in the Bible, and it is higher than all reason, like Martin Luther translated. This is also something people can experience: peace, peace of mind, and be peace, and transport this peace coming from the inner space. All these experiences might be very important for all activities around peace. And then it's also important to develop hope when there is no hope or no control of the situation. Because empathy is good for creating reconciliation, but something we found out in a study we made with Israelis and Palestinians, they can develop empathy for the suffering of the other, but to develop willingness to reconcile, there must also be hope. And this hope is often not present in the actual situation in this country. So this is a photo of the Kwibuka 2020 as well from Kigali. And those are only some thoughts to open a dialogue, and thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you very much, Martin. Our next speaker is truly international. He probably came from the far away from, everyone is truly international, but he comes from Japan, which is now 10 p.m. I really want you to realize it's like 10:30 p.m. right now. Toyomi Asano is a historian, prominent historian and political scientist. He really worked on this border between two disciplines. He currently works in Waseda University in Japan, and he's similar to Martin. He also started the Center for Reconciliation Studies in Waseda. It's first Center for Reconciliation Studies in Asia, Northeast Asia. And he also authored multiple publications, and he's a winner of multiple prizes for his books and his articles. Toyomi, please.
Thank you so much, Karina, for my introduction. And I'm very pleased, I'm very honored to have an opportunity to present my own articles. And yeah, my topic is about nationalism and reconciliations. As Professor Martin presented, transformation of oneself or transformation of nation or transformation of groups is indispensable to support the reconciliations in a new relationships. It's my own argument. But how can we inspire one's individual or nations to be changed? And changing is not so scaring, but welcoming. Maybe changing unilaterally would be reacted very severely, but changing in a new relationships, each other would not trigger the reactions, but I hope it would be entrance of the reconciliations. Oh, sorry. So as for the universal models of reconciliations, which could be applied to most conflicts, my answer is negative, because conflicts follow indigenous contexts. I'm sorry, it's a Korean case. But at least, because conflicts follow indigenous context, but at least I believe that there must be some common patterns of reconciliation, because in the contemporary world, we are supposed to live in each one nation, even though its territorial and human boundaries are contested. As you may know, nations are imagined in our own minds. We cannot directly either see or feel a nation without some symbolic activities and languages, such as national ceremonies, anthem, and reading textbooks. Nation could be regarded as a kind of secular religions, and the nation building process itself do sometimes support domestic reconciliation in a national society by integrating several formerly conflicting groups into a nation, and by sharing national norms as a constitutions and its supporting emotions, reflecting the experience of all groups as a part of a new national memory. However, people sometimes contest as a nation over which memory should be selected, as you see in the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States today. Also, there is another type of conflicts between nations, which sometimes entail strong emotions bound with selected historical memories, such as territories and victims before and just after a nation is born. As in East Asia, you can see in the conflict inside Taiwan, mainlanders and pro-Taiwanese, or another conflict between Japan and Korea. In this context, I want to briefly summarize my argument first. The essentially common pattern of reconciliation could be based upon a kind of transformations of nation as an agent of human collective identity and a pattern of self-ruling system. This concept of reconciliation entailing each agent's transformations could be differentiated from compromise in international politics, when every nation states would not be changed at all, as they are just trading their own national interests as for security or economic matters. Most of severe contemporary conflicts between nations and within a nation seems to derive from the transformation process of indigenous people as a nations. Nation state system is nothing but the result of the transformation. Furthermore, while West European nation state system was born in the natural process of Enlightenment movement in 16th century, civil revolutions and wars in 18th to 19th centuries, which entailed its expansion. Most nation states, but however, most nation states in East Europe, Asia, and Africa have been so-called artificially made, chasing for West Europeans' models of nation states as a unit of self-rule and its independence. In this context, a newly born national society and its relation with neighboring nations are becoming the cause of conflict. In short, the process of shocking events, such as occupation, independence, and wars in the process of the nation building is producing the cause of conflicts. example of this conflict among non-European nations, such as between Turkey and Albania, and Israel and Palestine, and perhaps Ukraine and Russia. They represent these conflicts that derive from the process of nation building, which was enabled by involving the neighboring another nations. Such past conflicts, which turned into memory and combined with tangible issues, such as territory, security, economy, would give rise to contemporary conflicts. So memory of the past conflicts when the nation became independent and the tangible issues such as security or economics would be intertwined and becoming contemporary conflicts. And they in turn produce the conflicts of national emotions of two sides. In these situations, so the unforgettable others is former enemies when the nation became independent, and it is also like a sense of relative exploitations by others. So how the collective identity as ourselves from others will be born. It is related with the concept of a sense of relative exploitations. Because of others, our destinies are exploited in this way. In this situation, domestic politics cannot be differentiated from international politics because politicians' legitimacy derives from its loyalty to its own nation. However democratic nation it might be, legitimate politicians who express the national emotion properly would be selected in due course in the democratic elections. On the other hand, in international politics, memories evoking strong emotions inside the country must be supported by universal values, such as human rights, development and peace, which sometimes conflict with each other. Furthermore, in order to reflect the universal values such as source of soft power, domestic politicians must express their national emotions in a more universal languages. Then the politician would be regarded as loyal politicians to its own nations. In this way, two levels of politics are constructing a strong structure. It could be called a resonance between two levels of politics, in which nation is fixed. In this structure, nation is fixed and cannot be transformed so drastically, cannot be changed. On the other hand, citizens, other peoples, can be easily transformed because we belong to an international society as a global citizens, and through the network of through the personal international networks, we could catch up to the new norms, new human rights, comparatively easily compared with the transformation of the collective identity as a nations. Because a nation is, it is very difficult for the nations to be transformed because of the existence of the structure in the slide in this way. A good example of this structure transcending two levels of politics is the contemporary relationships between Japan and South Korea. I have already skipped the slides, but you may know the statue of Comfort Women's, which is situated just in front of the gate of Japanese embassy in Seoul. It has becoming a very severe conflicting issues between two nations. And also the forced labor accused Japanese company in Korean criminal courts, because Japanese Supreme Court courts has already judged Korean criminals are not qualified to sue the Japanese company anymore. Then the Korean criminals bring the suits to Korean Supreme Court and accused Japanese companies which branches located in Seoul. It has the relationship between two countries has deteriorated severely over each. Because over the national and very strong national emotions are now evoked in the newspapers or in the televisions, documentaries, and everyday news. Even researchers are consciously or even unconsciously influenced by these situations, supported by social institutions such as universities and media that are functioning in a national society. Morality or personality would be contested if he dares or he or she dares to challenge the contemporary set of national emotions. Those who advocate a new type of reconciliations between two countries would be marginalized easily by being labeled either as pro-Koreans in Japanese society or pro-Japanese in Korean society. How can we approach these conflicts from the standpoint of reconciliation studies? And how can we transform each nation in a new relationships? I want to propose two approaches to calm down our own national emotions, even to find out a key to transform a nation as an agent of reconciliations. Sorry. The first one is to argue for and share a common recognition towards the function of the factors I mentioned, emotions, memories, and so-called universal values among ourselves. However, different emotions and memories we might have in our own minds, we would be able to make a consensus on how memories, values, and emotions are combined to build our nations, producing the two levels of conflicting memories. I hope such recognitions, my tentative recognitions would help understand the constructed character of our nations, because nation itself have been newly constructed within 100 years or 150 years, very artificially made. The second approach is also to nurture our consensus among scholars and practitioners as a specialist on the past development of conflicting nations by focusing upon its sharing events and space, such as colonialism, wars, and economic relations. I guess the East Asian regions as a common concept should be argued as a part of global histories. By bridging the first and second approaches, reconciliation studies would be increasingly more attractive to those citizens in the global age who regard simple national discourses as boring and frozen. I hope in some new future, the transformation of nations would be evoked by being able to discuss its function of emotions or memories in the same framework, and also by sharing a kind of global history. I hope reconciliation studies would inspire younger generations and globalized citizens, giving them the power to resist against old nationalism. Mission of our reconciliation studies seems to focus upon how we can find new channels to transform our nation, each other, even unconsciously, in order for us to adapt to another set of conflicting universal values. So my first argument is to make a common framework by which we can discuss the function of nation, a function of memories, a function of emotions, national emotions. The second argument is to make a regional framework, or regional framework to argue national history or national history itself. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Toyomi. Pleasure. So our next speaker is actually our director of our own center at our school, Center for Reconciliation. We're really, really pleased to have now with us Antti oh my gosh, I'm sorry, Pentikäinen, who is, sorry, Antti, who is the now our director for Marie Hawk Center for Reconciliation. And Antti has a very extensive history of working all over the world on reconciliation processes, especially with indigenous communities. He was special advisor for President on Finland. He works together with United Nations, with his visiting scholar in USAP, and the list of his achievements, especially in advising international organizations, can go on their own. So we're very pleased to have you with us at school, and also very pleased to have you on the panel.
Karina, thank you so much for your kind words, and thank you for leadership in setting this up. And I also want to recognize what our Dean Alp wrote. This is the first event of the first Carter School Peace Week. So thank you for all of us joining and contributing to this beautiful legacy. And thank you, Martin and Toyomi, for making the opening presentations. And always, I feel often confused with the concept of reconciliation, but when I listen to you, Martin, it starts to make sense again. So thank you for that very grounded and structured ideas, and Toyomi for spearheading your work in the East. It's beautiful to see here also our former colleague Pamina Virchow, who is doing very significant work in this field, and Fani, the Tuid, who is speaking later on, but also a lot of practical colleagues like Ali Ibrahim, with whom we worked in Somalia. My presentation will humbly try to approach the question of indigenous approaches to reconciliation. And when we look into the realities of indigenous people, they of course are very different, but they have a lot of common elements in them. And one of the overwhelming phenomenon is that they have been subject to different brutal policies of colonialism and assimilation that have affected their way of life, their communities, their own healers, and are in many cases and most often still affecting the realities of indigenous peoples' lives. So what you face within these communities is an element of suspicion towards the concept of reconciliation. For example, here in the United States, the number of indigenous people in the criminal justice system in jails, if I'm correct, is more than 1 million, 1.2 or 1.3 million people in jails, which is much bigger. It's not as big portion as from the African American community, but much bigger than from the white community. And so the element of continued systemic racism and legacies of what they have been subject to is still ongoing. And so what would be, what could reconciliation offer for them? And often the question is raised that would we want this justice, we want truth, justice, and reparations. But then the question one has to analyze is that, for example, internationally, if you focus on cases where reparations has been the end product of a process, has it meant that the conflict has ended? Has it meant that the situation has come down and the community relationships has healed? And what does it do internally for the communities themselves if there is not an emphasis on what reconciliation can offer. So my argument on reconciliation in the context of indigenous people, it is that it is a question of survival for these peoples. But how to approach it obviously has to require the community's own leadership. And I have to acknowledge I'm not indigenous myself. I'm neither Sami. And so I have not the right to speak for the Sami, but I can share some observations from my experiences as the Prime Minister's envoy in making the process move forward with a possible truth and reconciliation process between the government of Finland and the Sami people. Just one picture of perspectives towards the realities of the Sami. So they are the only living currently recognized indigenous people in Europe. They are living in Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia. There are altogether about 100,000 of the Sami. They have 4 existing major language groups, and they have had very different lifestyles in terms of hunting, fishing, and reindeer herding, but the dominant way of life perceived to be a Sami approach is the reindeer herding. And here in this picture in the center is Päivi Makka. She has worked with the Sami Museum in Inari, is now working on her PhD. She was in a training that I helped organize on reconciliation approaches, and with her daughter, they're mocking calves. And even though this seems to be like a very relaxed situation, it is a very emotional event also, because a unique skill is being transferred over generations to a new generation. Of course, there's a lot of worries. How will the reindeer herding survive with all the pressures of mining, the forestry, and a train track that has been advanced by the businesses towards the Lapland, through the Lapland to Kirkenes, to advance the trade over or the Arctic Sea, China, and many other questions. But it's also a picture which shows that the way of life is deeply connected to being a Sami and the culture. It's very hard to differentiate the way of life, and the rights of your livelihood is connected to the survival also of the culture and tradition. They're not disconnected. When I started to work on my support for the process, there were, of course, some Sami voices that challenged, do I have the right to be so heavily involved and have so much to say about the process? And that was a difficult question to me, and I know that this is a difficult question for all of us who are very deeply embedded in different processes. And so I went through some of my own soul searching, and I wanted to share this picture because this is a picture of my father, who in 1960s started an ethnographic research among the Sami, and for about 25 years he documented one specific village, interviewing everybody in the lives and documenting oral archives of the Sami and their worldview. And when I spoke to a lot of the Sami people who had lost their language, but later studied the language, they said that these tapes were a key for them to understand the worldview, that they needed to study the language, but to heal, to become a Sami, they had to hear how their ancestors believed and saw the world. And so I saw myself as a part of a chain of generations that can also make their contributions. So the question that was left behind was that I have to do what I can. It's not that whether I have the right, but if I can do something, it is an obligation. And I know that this is a foundation of the motivation of many of you in the work you do. So this picture is from February 2018, when a launching panel of the Truth and Reconciliation process was held. I'm there with then President of the Sami Parliament and some of the very prominent Sami activists and scholars and youth leaders, discussing what the Truth and Reconciliation process should look like. At this date, the Commission is not yet appointed. I think a real serious challenge for the Sami is that in order to have the ownership in a reconciliation process, you need to have a critical number of people who can understand what it is all about. So there has to be an element of sharing lessons learned, and I would also say capacity building for the community to take the real ownership, because until that collective ownership is there, the suspicion can easily overwhelm and distract the community. And I think they're still struggling with this question. We have been advising them, for example, how the appointment of the commission should be very open to avoid that the commission is being politicized. And for example, from the Canadian experience, like we were discussing in the context of possible truth and reconciliation process in the US, you should not appoint political representatives to a commission, but rather individuals who can carry the wounded people over the process into sharing and put this full element of healing. So I think these are some of the questions that the Sami are currently struggling with. Part of the approach we had was this capacity building or training, and this is a picture of a training for what we call insider reconcilers. It is a concept that is new, but it's following John Paul Lederach's idea of insider mediators, and we're looking into the subsection of reconciliation from the insider's perspective, and hoping to learn from these practices. This is a workshop they tweaked on based on Michael Lapsley's Healing of the Memories retreat, and so two people, one was a Sami scholar and one was a Finnish scholar. They developed a model of art and storytelling through nature. And here we have built a mandala of our life stories. And then here we're building a collective tent where everybody's bringing something from their own life story that they want to contribute to the healing process of the whole nation. So that's how individual life stories can connect to the stories of a nation. And this core group that often has been in the different fault lines of the conflicts collectively can envision and have the moral imagination for a reconciliation process and lead it further. Here's a picture of one of the Sami healers. They still have these existing healers in their community, often hidden. And so it's also beautiful that within the truth and reconciliation process, you can create space for the internal healers themselves to appear and be providing their presence for the suffering people and the families of today. So those three elements actually are here that I want to share, is that the process design, actually I'll pull one more picture, the process design that we had in our mind for the Sami was based also on John Paul Lederach's idea of a three-track approach. So this picture just summarizes somehow the challenge in South Africa, where we saw Archbishop Desmond Tutu and Alex Bahrain lead a process that were able to establish truth and momentarily also healing. But as this cartoon demonstrated, it is very complicated to move from the truth into reconciliation. And so within the Sami context, we tried to adjust the three-track approach used in mediation for a reconciliation process, which in this case meant that there is a commission, which is temporary, but we especially focus on what we call the insider reconcilers, people inside a community who can build bridges towards the other sides of the community, do a conflict assessment and a process design, and then start to implement. And this can be natural resources, they can be very practical issues, or they can be healing practices. So they will choose whatever is appropriate for them. And then the third track is a significant investment on individual and community-based healing, so that the traumatic events that and their effects on the individuals and communities could be left behind. I'll go back into my conclusions. So I have further few recommendations based on this one experience that you may want to consider when you are working with Indigenous people. So, of course, in an Indigenous truth and reconciliation process, the ownership and leadership comes from the community itself. And I believe it can be built on the community's own healing practices. So that's also why it is a question of survival for the Indigenous communities. Second, rightfully, Indigenous people have doubts and hesitations on reconciliation because there has also been bad experiences, how reconciliation process has been exploited by those in power to water down the grievances and suppress apology or forgiveness. And so the connection how indigenous rights and reconciliation intertwine has to be better understood. That is something we are also committed to learn at the Mary Hock Center. Third, the intergenerational pain does affect the realities of the communities of today. And without enabling individual and collective healing, communities are likely to continue to suffer. And I think this is the reality here in the United States as well. So unless there's ability to help individuals heal and communities heal, the spiral of pain is likely going to continue to affect the people. And fourth, this three-track approach might be helpful in designing a process, and that of course can work with other processes as well. And further, of course, research and study needs to be done how this is producing results. But in this model, a possible commission that's always a temporary and often focused on a report, you involve the communities and you empower them also, which is possible through an academic training. And then you build up with some mental health and psychosocial support elements into the process. Karina, back to you.
Thank you very much, Antti. This is really interesting, especially now that Arctic become one of the hot topics in not just research, but practice internationally. Your experience bringing it to us, it's very, very invaluable. So now we're moving into Africa, South Africa, and I'm really, really pleased to introduce Fanny de Toet, who was the executive director, and now senior advisor for Institute of Justice and Reconciliation in Cape Town, South Africa. He was working all over the world. Just to name a few is Kenya, Rwanda, Burundi, Ghana, just all recognizable countries. He co-edited multiple volumes on reconciliation, was visiting Scala and Kroc Institute and other places. And he was a Rhodes Scholar. So we're really pleased to have him today with us. Please.
Thank you, Karina. It's a real privilege also to join you on this esteemed panel and to make contact with GMU in this way. I'm very, very grateful to be here. And the topic that I've been given today is to look a little bit into the future and to identify, if possible, some of the kind of characteristics that future theories of reconciliation may have. Now, I would say from the outset that that's a fairly impossible task. And so even if I had a crystal ball, I think the way the world is right now, it's fairly murky. Many of us do not know how things will develop. It's very uncertain. And so I shall try to give it my best go, but just bear with me on this really difficult task. Then I want to propose, in the little bit of time that I have, 2 introductory remarks about theorizing reconciliation, and then 3 comments following from there. The 2 remarks to begin with, the two introductory remarks. The first one is that I think we should remember that we are a very, very young discipline, that we are 20 years, maybe 30 years old as a discipline if you conflate peace building, studies of peace building and that of reconciliation as a designated discipline. Whereas human rights studies, for example, are 60, 70 years old, ours is much younger. And it's really only got underway with Boutros Boutros-Ghali's paper, The Provocative and Agenda for Peace, that he brought out in 1992 from the United Nations. And then shortly thereafter, after that paper came out, it was, of course, the Berlin Wall came down just before that. Eastern Europe became individual countries away from the USSR, and South Africa's apartheid era ended, and Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu used the word reconciliation to capture their political agenda. And as such, I think the concept of reconciliation gained enormous international recognition during that period. Even as South Africans became quite fatigued with this word over time, when Mandela passed away in 2013, the reconciliation agenda was firmly back on the national radar, as people were trying to assess whether South Africa had in fact reconciled or not after Mandela's life. Around that time too, I did a study on reconciliation theories globally, and it came to the conclusion that one could really group theories of reconciliation into three main clusters or families of theories of reconciliation. The one group of theories out there is really built around the idea of liberalism and human rights. So reconciliation is essentially liberal peace, that reconciliation is reached when you have a liberal democracy, basically. And the efforts to build a human rights fearing country is really the agenda of reconciliation. And it focuses these theories of reconciliation focus largely on institution building as the main emphasis of what reconciliation is about. The second group of theories are very different, and they come from restorative justice principles and are largely shaped within the language of restorative justice and focus on the enemy relationship, the relationship between enemies and how that is transformed, with forgiveness as a central concept. In liberal theories of reconciliation, forgiveness does not play a large role, but in restorative justice concepts of reconciliation, forgiveness is central. And then of late, a third cluster of theories of reconciliation are those coming from agonism, the agonist theories, building more or less on the Hannah Arendt frameworks of politics as a form of peace building, politics as a form of reconciliation, political engagement and contestation, shooting each other with words rather than with bullets. And so from these three theories of reconciliation, these three clusters, I then developed my own take on reconciliation, drawing on some of the strengths and also rereading the South African history and seeing what it is that motivated South Africans to begin to reach out to one another, to sustain this process over 10 years, and eventually to embrace a multiracial democracy with a vast social transformation program that is as yet incomplete and still frustratingly slow, but nevertheless aiming to change every dimension of life. And the central concept that came out of that is the concept of interdependence, that apartheid was essentially the denial that people lived in the same country and that the well-being of one group was directly related to the well-being of another. There was a cognitive dissonance between reality and the way that apartheid ideologues described their reality, as if they could prosper while Black people would suffer. And the acceptance of reconciliation was built on the fact, on the acknowledgement that we're sharing the same resources, the same country, the same space geographically, and that one group will never be able to flourish sustainably unless the other group also have a hope to flourish sustainably. And that central idea, we have no choice, we're in this together, of interdependence, whether we like it or not. That is the concept, I think, that drove our reconciliation process, and it also so happened to link very closely with Ubuntu, which is the African philosophy that builds around a relational view of identity, which means that individuals are essentially relational beings, not individual beings that have to seek relationships, but that we are formed by relationships in our deepest core, that in fact we don't have a deep core other than those, the core of relationships. That's the first point. And I think we need to make sure that we understand that in this quest for, theorizing reconciliation in the future, we need to be very clear on the concepts that we use as we go forward. The second remark I want to leave you with as an introductory remark is that reconciliation is no longer very much understood as reconciliation with the exotic other that is on the other side of the world. It's very much more a process between people that are living in a shrinking world. International law already recognizes that as human beings, we're already in relationship with one another through the concept of a crime against humanity. And as the world continues to shrink through social media, as natural resources begin to dwindle, as superpowers begin to realize their global interests are interlinked, we will understand again the concept of Ubuntu. I could add to that list also, of course, pandemics like COVID. My humanity is already interlinked with yours. And therefore, if things go wrong, this relationship goes wrong, it becomes codependent, perhaps even openly hostile. But a future theory of reconciliation would have to account for a relational understanding of reality. And in that case, I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done in developing a critical relationship between, for example, liberal peace building and the ideas of reconciliation as relational, and the impact that may have on our political practices. We are all saying democracy seems to be in trouble. Well, perhaps it is because we are fragmenting society in ways that makes relationships very difficult. And perhaps a serious rethinking of reconciliation within political studies may help us with that. Now, I would like to go to the 3 specific questions, which will take me only a couple of minutes to go through, which I think any theory of reconciliation ought to be able to answer in the future. The first question concerns inception. How do we make a start? How do we turn a relationship that's become oppressive around? How is it possible to start in the middle of enmity, in conditions that militate against the very existence of what we are striving for? I often hear many parts of the world that reconciliation works there, but it won't work here because the conditions are not right. Well, reconciliation worth its salt should be able to work precisely where the conditions are not right and conducive. That is by definition where reconciliation ought to make a start. And that reminds me of the importance of the overlap between not reconciliation studies and political studies, as I mentioned earlier, but reconciliation and linguistics, the study of language, reconciliation and literature, the study of narrative, of poetry, of art, because it's essentially with the artisans of the word that we as reconciliation scholars need to go and light a candle so that we can borrow language from them, language that will help us to reach out in places where reaching out seems impossible. In political terms, often how this is articulated is we do not speak to terrorists. Terrorists are not people we can negotiate with. Well, you can't talk to a terrorist until you start talking to them. And once you start talking to them, they're no longer terrorists. So the very words offered in reconciliation has a performative action. It performs, it creates a new reality that does not exist. And so the performative aspect of language, I think, is central here. By taking up carefully selected words, we are producing a new reality that is not yet there, and in the absence of which it seems impossible to reach out. I want to say one word about the inception of reconciliation too, that should start in the midst of when things are really tough, and that is the word of justice. I believe justice is the sister concept to reconciliation, the discipline of reconciliation. Whereas reconciliation keeps justice inclusive and relational, justice keeps reconciliation honest. And without justice as a very strong component of a reconciliation process, reconciliation can become pacification. And reconciliation as pacification is none other than a betrayal of the victim. But reconciliation coupled with justice is a radical concept of reconciliation that is far more revolutionary than a revolution. Because a revolution simply turns the powers upside down, but keeps the structure of society. Whereas reconciliation transforms society in a far more radical way. And but it can only do so if it's accompanied by the concept of justice. And I want to point my colleagues in the direction of a rereading, perhaps at some point, of Emmanuel Levinas and his wonderful work around justice that makes an appeal on you when you engage the other. That very moment you look the other in the eye is the moment that justice jumps up at you, makes an appeal to you. And so justice needs to accompany reconciliation. The second question, which a future reconciliation theory ought to answer, is the question of transition, is the question of change, is the question from how do we get from A to B or A to F. It's the question of causality. It's the question of moving beyond the words and into movement building, not just articulation, but also movement building, changing society in ways that are fundamental and lasting. And here, I think reconciliation studies ought to work closely with sociologists, with those in the peace studies departments, with law as well. We have things like truth and reconciliation commissions. We have tribunals. We have reparation processes, all designed to take society from point A to point B. What we are not good on at this point, however, is being precise about the causalities. We're not yet clear exactly that this actually leads to this. For example, by holding somebody criminally accountable, we are assuming we're building the rule of law. Well, we need to explain that more carefully. How is that precisely done? How do we know that this will lead to the outcomes that we are attaching to certain actions? And I think here it is very important that we break justice as the accompaniment of reconciliation down into very simple, more simple concepts, inclusion and fairness, so that we can judge whether a reconciliation process is doing well by applying those two concepts. Inclusion, with other words, are the processes becoming more inclusive or less inclusive? Are there more people involved or less people? Is it going beyond the political elite? Is it taking some root in society or not? And second, fairness, which means once people are at the table, is what is being done there fair to everybody? Does everybody have a sense that fairness is being adhere to. And here I'm deliberately using the word fairness, not justice, because sometimes absolute justice is not possible during reconciliation processes. Sometimes absolute justice, as Nir Isakovich says, leads to absolute injustice. So one has to be incremental about justice sometimes, step by step. But fairness, what we can live with for the moment, I think is a good concept. And finally, the question is then what, so I've spoken about inception, I've spoken also about transition, and then the final concept I want to leave you with is the one of social transformation. What society is the outcome of a reconciliation process? And here, I think we talk that I found, we talk about concepts which I think Professor Asano really did some very interesting thoughts earlier about issues of identity and memory, issues of dignity and respect, historical injustice, belonging and having, perhaps are the two key words there. Who have what and who belongs where. And here, of course, we're now learning that reconciliation is not just the preserve of failed states, former dictatorships, places where civil war had raged, but even in very established democracies, reconciliation processes are important because people feel excluded. A study, and with this I end, Karina, a study from your university, George Mason, recently, I could not believe my eyes when I read that, published by CNN, did a report on this, child deaths in birth, young infants in Florida between 1992 and 2005. I think something like 19 million child deaths studied in this report, or 19,000, I'm sorry, I can't remember the exact amount. But the upshot is that Black babies are twice as likely to die at childbirth than white babies in the United States, twice as likely to die, except when they are looked after by white doctors. Then it becomes 3 times as likely to die. So that the death rate of babies depend on the race group of the doctor that look after them, for Black babies, not for white babies. Now, if that is the case in society, if that is the case, if I understood that report correctly, then established democracies have a lot of work to do on justice, and do that through processes of reconciliation that accept the reality of the other person in society with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yes, this was a research supported by Robert Wood Foundation. Yeah, I saw it too. It was very, very, very inciting in understanding how race works even in situation of health. I'm really pleased to introduce my fellow psychologist, Erin Adler, who, in addition to be a very prolific writer and author on multiple books and articles on reconciliation, also hold a lot of leadership position in reconciliation in Middle East. He was dean and chair of psychology department. He also was founding director of the Center for Peace Studies, and he also was a director of Institute for Regional Cooperation and Diplomacy in Tel Aviv University. He served as a chairperson in multiple foundations for social science research, for education, and put a lot of efforts in providing possibilities for people to learn and also be engaged in reconciliation in the Middle East. Very pleased to have you here with us, Erin. We could not hear you. Can you unmute yourself?
Right.
Oh,
And
yeah,
then
good.
you share screen. Where is it?
It's like down there. It should be like a green share screen in the middle.
I can see that, but I want to find my PowerPoint presentation, which just a second. I'll open it again. Okay. Now, how do I share? Now I share it. Okay, share screen. Here it is. Okay.
Yes,
okay.
Perfectly.
Thank you for having me and for the kind words of introduction and talking about reconciliation. Well, maybe I'll begin by noting the fact that I became interested in the topic about close to 20 years ago when I was part of the Paris Center for Peace in Tel Aviv. And one of the issues is, not in academic or conceptual manner, was the issue of reconciliation between Israelis and Palestinians and the possibility of doing this. This was in the heyday of the post-Oslo agreements, and there was hope on the ground, hope that has evaporated since then. Hopefully, it will flourish again in the future. What I want to do, I want to talk about reconciliation as a social psychologist. And as a social psychologist, I want to first ask the question, what is reconciliation? How is it different from other sister concepts like conflict resolution, making peace, and so on and so forth, conflict settlement? So what is special and unique about reconciliation, which is not captured by the other concepts? And I think that if you went on the street, the word Hebrew is pius, and it means something deeper than just ending conflict or resolving it or making peace. It means something deeper, and I think that if you went on the street and asked people about what reconciliation is, you'd get the feeling that they hear something that is deeper than just ending conflict. And reconciliation, I want to begin by noting that for example, in the 16th century, Oxford Dictionary described reconciliation as, and I'm quoting, restoring sacred use to church tools that had been desecrated and also reuniting in harmony. In other words, reconciliation from that perspective is mending broken relationships. Mending broken relationships between church tools and between people. But when we talk about reconciliation, we need to make a distinction, because sometimes my experience has been that we confuse between the outcome of reconciliation and the process of reconciliation. So I want to first talk about very briefly about the outcome of reconciliation. What do we mean when we say an outcome of reconciliation? And then move to the processes of reconciliation from a psychological point of view. So first of all, the outcome of reconciliation has three elements, at least to my view. We talk about positive relationships, trustworthy, positive relationships between former enemies. We talk about positive social identity, and that's a key issue. Positive social identity of to us, because during conflict, especially during violent conflict, both parties' identities are being threatened. Conflict creates threats to identities, which I will talk about more fully later on. And the trustworthy, positive relationship of positive social identities interact in an equality-based structure, social structure. I will not talk about the equality-based social structure, because I think that is something that economists, sociologists, and other social scientists talk about better than I could ever do. But if I look at the definition, it's basically a three-part definition that is arranged in a pyramidical order. The basic is equal social structure. Only on the basis of equality can you begin to build trust between the two adversaries. And only on the basis of trust can you begin the process of identity restoration of the basically threatened identity of the two parties. So this is one way of looking of what the outcome of reconciliation is. And I want now to move to the to thinking about aloud on the processes of reconciliation. How do you get there? How do you get to a process of reconciliation between two adversaries? Let me make a note in parentheses that as far as I'm concerned, the same basic processes occur between individuals and between groups. There are many differences, but basic processes of reconciliation between two estranged individuals in conflict are basically the same processes that occur between groups that have been in conflict. And the thing that makes reconciliation or the concept different than other concepts is that we're talking about reconciliation as the process of removing emotional blocks to end the conflict. Because the prevailing view, when I began dealing with the issue of reconciliation close to 20 years ago, was that conflict usually is viewed from an economic point of view. In other words, the two parties disagree on dividing resources that both desire. It can be money, it can be land, it can be water. And then they negotiate and they arrive at some agreed upon formula for the division of these resources. And that's the end of conflict. Reconciliation was not at the center of this discussion of social scientists as it is more so today. And reconciliation from that perspective focuses on the emotional blocks that create a wall between the two parties and prevent them from ending the conflict. The two kinds of such emotional blocks that I will now go into in more detail. One is the emotional block of distrust and negative relationships between the two parties. And the other are the conflict-related threats to identities. Let me move to each of these two kinds of emotional blocks in some more details. When we're talking about reconciliation, when we're talking about building trust, reducing or ameliorating the first emotional block between the two parties, increasing trust between them and decreasing animosity between them. We've called it in our work, my work and that with my colleagues, instrumental reconciliation. Instrumental reconciliation is basic trust building between former enemies. It's decreasing animosity and establishing basic trust between adversaries. How do you do that? You do that what social psychologists have been doing for many, many years, since the 1940s, under the label of the contact hypothesis. You get people to cooperate. You get people from both sides to cooperate in an equal status basis to achieve a common goal. Examples are numerous. All peace building projects are based on this idea. Northern Ireland, Balkans, the Middle East, post-Oslo Middle East, are all based on the idea that, now I'm using an example, that if Israelis and Palestinians cooperate positively on an equal status basis to build a hospital that will serve both communities, they will learn to trust each other. They will learn to overcome the animosity that each feels towards the other, and that will be the instrumental path, the instrumental road towards reconciliation. The differences between this and the second path or road toward reconciliation is great. The second path toward reconciliation, and I will use here already the concept of apology and forgiveness, is something completely different. It intends to reduce the conflict-related threats to each of the parties' identities. So the focus is not on the relationships, not on the trust that I feel towards the other. It's the way I feel upon myself when I look at myself in the mirror. Because we begin with the assumption that human beings have two very basic human needs: the need for agency and the need for communion, the need for power, self-determination, self-control, which is agency, and the need for communion, the need to belong, the need to be accepted by others. The thing is, conflict, violent conflicts, presents threats to both of these needs. Victims suffer a threat to their identity as agentic social actors. The word victim implies being powerless, lacking self-control, not being independent. So victims suffer a threat to their identity as agentic, as powerful and self-controlling individuals or parties. Perpetrators suffer a different kind of threat. The conflict-related threat to perpetrators is that their moral image is threatened. They've been doing wrong things, and therefore they are being in danger of excluded from the moral community to which they belong. The danger here, or the threat here for the perpetrators, is the communion, the belongingness and understanding by others. So these two kinds of threats basically operate as blocks towards reconciliation, and parties do not leave these threats unmanaged. They manage with them. Victims deal with the threats to their agency and self-control by taking revenge. Revenge is healthy psychologically. It imparts a sense of power and self-control to a powerless victim. On the other hand, perpetrators use tactics of moral disengagement, a concept coined by Bandura, to deal with the threat to their moral identity, to their moral image. They would say things like, we had no choice. We had to hurt them, to harm them. They use language to deal with the threats to their moral image. Collateral damage is a very poignant example of using language to reduce the amount of threats to their own moral image. The problem with these unilateral ways of dealing with conflict-related threats to identity is that they prolong conflict. Revenge, my revenge, is perceived by you as my aggression that needs to be avenged. And the cycle goes on and on. And of course, all tactics of moral disengagement are the tactics that prepare the ground for the next aggression to come along. So this is this unilateral amelioration of identity-related threats actually prolongs conflict, and which we can achieve solution. And here I'm talking about an example, is the apology forgiveness cycle. The apology forgiveness cycle is basically a social exchange whereby victims are empowered, the threat to their agency is lowered, and perpetrators feel accepted and understood. The threat to the communion is lowered. It is because apology and forgiveness and seeking forgiveness transforms the power relations between victims and perpetrators. The victim gains power by being able to grant or withhold forgiveness. And by being forgiven, the perpetrator is readmitted into the moral communities. So once this social dance, if you will, of the apology cycle is completed successfully, the threats to both parties' identities, which have caused the conflict to go on and actually intensify, the threats are being diffused and socio-emotional reconciliation can proceed. I will not, this is the model. I will not go into that, into too much detail. It will be in the PowerPoint presentation that will be distributed later on, and you can basically see what I just said in a more pictorial manner in a matter of a model. We've had a lot of data in many areas that support the validity of the model, and the idea is, that's the major idea, that once you satisfy the power needs of the victim, you make victims more likely to reconcile. Satisfy the communion needs of the perpetrator, acceptance and being readmitted, perpetrators would be more willing to reconcile. So reconciliation works through basically ameliorating the threats to both parties' individual needs. Now, this is important because I think that it tells us one important point, is that also perpetrators have needs. And the needs of perpetrators and victims are not the same. So generalistic statements like social harmony may work well as a title, but they do not pave the way towards processes of reconciliation in the way I just noted. Let me say a few more things, and I don't want to go too much into that, but things about, there's a basic difference between processes of instrumental and socio-emotional reconciliation. There's several of them, but I will focus on one. Instrumental processes, whereby what I earlier labeled as cooperation towards achieving a common goal in an equal status context. Cooperation, the idea is that cooperation in the present, okay, is the key to reconciled future. In other words, when Israelis and Palestinians cooperate to build a hospital that will serve both communities, they implicitly say to each other, let bygones be bygones. We don't want to go to the past. We don't want to begin about you did that to me and you did the other thing to me. Let bygones be bygones. The present is the key to reconciled future. That's instrumental reconciliation, the trust building sort of reconciliation. Socio-emotional processes, or in terms of the apology forgiveness cycle, makes the opposite statement, that only dealing with the past of pain and suffering of the conflict, only that is the key to reconciled future. Unless you have dealt with the past, you cannot have a reconciled future. These are very two different ways of approaching reconciliation. And I want also to note towards the end of my short talk today, is not always we need to go through the apology forgiveness cycle. When are we going to use or to focus on trust building? And then when are we going to focus on forgiveness? Put the present at focus, and when are we going to put the past at focus as the, if you will, as the door towards reconciliation? I think it depends on the goal of reconciliation. Where do we want to be at the end? Because there are two different goals to the end of conflict. One of them is separation. I want to end the conflict whereby you and I will be separated. There's a clear boundary between the two of us, and all we want to do is to live in a conflict-free coexistence. Under these conditions, we don't need to go into the past. Under these conditions, going into the past may exacerbate conflict, may make reconciliation even harder. When integration is the goal, we both live in the same community, and we want to just so that we can live in the same community in harmony. Socio-emotional reconciliation is needed. Going into the past when I hurt you and you suffered because of me, and going through the process of apology, forgiveness cycles of this way or the other is a must. There's a very nice illustration of that. Long and Brecker wrote a book about person reconciliation committees and found out that most persons in reconciliation committees are within societies, are intra-societal processes, not between societies, not between countries, but within countries. That's basically the major point that I'm trying to make here. So reconciliation is a multifaceted concept. The processes of trust building may be appropriate for one condition and not for. And the example that I'm using usually to make it clear, because I think that's a very important point, the example of a couple that has been in conflict and has hurt each other in the past, betrayals and so on and so forth. If they want to divorce, then there's no need to go into the past of mutual hurting, but only to build a trustworthy relationship that will allow them to coexist in the future and manage their joint interests, children, property, whatever. If they want to rebuild their family, then they must go into the past and begin the social dance of the apology forgiveness cycle. I will finish my comments by telling you about what I did not talk about today, which I think is very important. And this is the thing that we work today. First of all, the issue of victimhood and the competition for victimhood, where the two parties compete about the title of who is the right victim, okay? Who is the more legitimate victim? And competition for victimhood is a block towards reconciliation. That's something that needs to be taken care of in another conversation, another talk. And the other thing, which I think is very important, that's something that we're doing today, is when does reconciliation lead to social action, or the links between reconciliation and social action. Galtung has differentiated between structural aggression and direct aggression, direct violence. Direct violence is structural violence. Direct violence occurs in war. So occurs within societies, discrimination, prejudice, and so on and so forth. Now, there's a link between working towards reducing structural violence within societies and processes of reconciliation that I talked about earlier, a link that takes the example, for example, and that's and with that I will end, that the advantage group reconciles with the disadvantaged group and is willing to take joint social action to remedy the injustice and inequality and achieve a better and more just and equal relationships between the two groups. So thank you very much again for having given me the opportunity to share with you these thoughts. And thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for your presentation. And we have a few minutes left, so I will try to breeze through my presentation as quickly as I can. So then we might be able to take, Michael can be able to take several questions. Let me try to share my screen. So as many participants told today that reconciliation is really dealing with identity-based issues, but also really dealing with the past. So I want just to stress that reconciliation really happens in the midst of identity-based conflict. Martin always stressed that reconciliation always has to start not after the conflict, but in the midst of conflict, and many participants completely agree with it. So it's really dealing with social boundaries, a reduction of threat, as Ari just told. It's also a creation of environment of cooperation and coexistence with as a norms of society. And as also as we discussed today, development of friendship, trust, empathy, understanding, but dealing with very controversial issues of equality and justice, because we see in many cases and pursuit for justice sometimes may become impediment for reconciliation. So how to, and Fanny told very, very great ideas how we can actually build together these very, very important foundations. And of course, we're speaking about formation of common identities. So major point is that societies affected by identity-based conflicts, process of facing the past is actually not neutral, is embedded in interrelations between groups, redefined identities embedded in a system of power, of legitimacy, and we really have to think about it. What I mean by facing the past, there are multiple ways or activities or practices of facing the past, including education, media, memorials, commemoration practices, restoration of and rebuilding museums. So there are multiple ways how society try to face the past. But I want to stress that there are several dilemmas how we deal with it. Let me go just through each of them. First one is between critical history and monumental history. Monumental history is a selective remembering of particular events. Then this particular events transform into inspiring myths, and myths take place of reality, take myths of historical narrative. And what is important that these protagonists of the myth are present, they're inspiring, they're prototypical, and they continue dividing societies. At the same time, monumental history is critical for nation building processes. For example, Toyomi was telling today, because it's increased loyalty to nations, it's help elite, but it's also connect people to society. For example, in Taiwan, and they decided not to use history as a required subject in schools, everyone started leaving the country because there was no connection, no loyalty to the country. And critical history, on the other hand, is really important for improvement of society. We analyze and restore justice. It's change myth, mythologization of society, creation alternative narratives. Today we were speaking about agonistic approaches to history, dissonance heritage. There are a lot of ways how scholarship now are addressing these issues, multi-perspectivity and others. And it gives us multiple interpretations. But the problem is does not provide sense of continuity, patriotism, loyalty. It doesn't contribute to nation building process. So how we find this balance between critical history? For example, in Germany, we see a lot of backlash now against very critical history, and how young generation really creating the new myth of peaceful revolution, for example, right? The fall of the wall as a peaceful revolution, and providing more pride in heroes instead of critical approach to history. And examples in Macedonia, we have monumental history, which promotes ethnocentric approach. Pakistan, we see monumental history, which actually help create this strong boundary between Hindi and Muslims. In Croatia, we see both critical and monumental, while everything else is really presented for critical history. The homeland war still is very monumentalistic narratives. Second dilemma is dilemma between meaning of history as a past or as a possibility of events reoccurring. In many cases, we see discourses that we need to forget early violent events, move towards a peaceful society. avoid teaching. This is what Ari was speaking about, instrumental approach, avoid teaching people about violence, because teaching them about violence, which promote more negative feelings. But in the same time, if we do not speak about the past, past constitute identity. And it's also define what are values and how a group perform based on these values. And we can see that if we are not analyzing how violence were produced, how society become divided and led to conflict, then we could not understand current views and attitudes. And so possibility of this approach, then we see history as lessons learned give us freedom to make decisions. Examples in Sierra Leone and Uganda, we really see that history considered past, not important to discuss. It's not taught, it's not discussed in practices, and actually there are a lot of avoidance. And I give examples of Germany and United States. Of course, there are always multiple questions about it. For example, the slavery is still questionable issue, or post-colonial topics are very questionable in Europe, but still we can see that history education really worked, and Germany pioneered this approach to history education as prevention of violence. Third dilemma is between remembering and forgetting. What amount of remembering is sufficient for reconciliation? How much we have to tell about conflict if we decide to tell about conflict? So forgetting actually is advocated because people believe that if we describe violence, then it's actually provoke more revenge, as what Ari was telling, or aggressive intentions. While other people who tell we need to acknowledge that what's done in order to make amendment to it. So how we select what to remember, what to forget, and it's bringing us back to first dilemma. How we select, right? We create this bias selective history trying to represent, which lead actually to prejudice and justice. For example, in Guatemala, it concentrates on human rights, cultural rights, indigenous group, peace processes, and so on. But selective history lead to misconceptions because both sides presented as both responsible for the violence, while imbalance of power is not represented there. And Rwanda, for example, we know that selective history lead to complete control of Tutsi-dominated party. And finally, dilemma is how we deal with the past, or we deal with other social important projects. And we see that in many countries, post-conflict countries, facing difficult economic situation and others, people contribute more money into social projects, healthcare, and others, instead of dealing with the past, which actually create a lot of problems in society. And like Fanny gives us example of racial inequality in healthcare, that we can contribute to healthcare a lot, but if we do not deal with legacy of slavery, we will still have a lot of problems. So I will finish here, and we have a few minutes left. And Mike, I will give you opportunity to maybe take several questions. Again, thank you very much. And before we'll just go for questions, I wanted to, let me stop sharing. Stop share, wonderful. I just want to stress one more time that I'm very pleased to have this event as a starting event for our International Peace Week. Thank you for our Dean who started this wonderful new tradition. And I'm really pleased to be here together with Toyomi and Martian because, and other members of the panel who worked together with us to establish International Association for Reconciliation Studies. Website is coming. I tried to show the website, but it's not yet, it's still in development. But we hope that everyone can join us in this association. We're looking forward to cooperation because we really, similar as this panel, we really see this association as opportunity for people from different disciplines, different regions, different backgrounds to come together and discuss how we see reconciliation, what are problems, what are dilemmas of it, and how to deal with it. Toyomi, yeah. Toyomi wanted to say something.
Oh yeah, it's my question. Yeah.
So Mike, it's yours.
Great.
Yeah, it's great.
Sure.
Yeah.
Just quickly, a couple notes about questions. So first of all, thank you to all the panelists for speaking. This is really great and important conversation. Hopefully in these past few minutes, we can take a few questions. If you have a question, we'd love for you to be able to just ask it yourself. So if you have a question, either use the Zoom function to raise your hand or send me a message in the chat and I can unmute you to ask the question. If you'd rather that I ask it, you can send a message by chat and then I can just ask the question. But we'll start with you, Toyomi.
Yeah. Thank you so much for taking the time for my questions. Funny to what using the example of South Africa, he just proposed differentiation between reconciliation with justice and reconciliation without justice. And reconciliation with justice is very revolutionary. Yeah, I deeply agree with his argument, but sometimes reconciliation with justice conflict each other. The reconciliation based upon human rights sometimes conflict with another type of reconciliation with international law or agreement. Because I don't have enough time to argue the very complicated aspect of the conflict between Japan and South Korea. But I guess it is what kind of justice should be selected, whether it should be human rights or whether it should be agreements or international law. So it's a very severely contested each other. But I deeply agree. Sometimes, like example of South Africa, Black people's situation should be completely renovated based upon the equality of races and sharing the same justice together, and the minority would be accepted by majority, and the reconciliation with justice sometimes works very well, but sometimes don't work, and rather it sometimes evokes the severer conflicts. So how do you think about the two kind of situations? It's my question to Fanny. I guess this question is closely related with another panelist's presentations. Can you understand my questions?
Fanny, would you like to respond or?
Chair, I'm not sure whether would you like us to just do one-on-one question answer session or take a few more questions first?
Yeah.
I'm happy to respond.
Yeah, we unfortunately have very few minutes left. We actually already, we can add 5 minutes because there is other session coming after it. But so if we don't have any more questions for now, maybe you answer and maybe we can, and Mike will see how it's.
Well, I think that, I mean, very, very briefly, this is, of course, one of the age-old debates in our field is the relationship between justice and reconciliation. And the two need to be somehow managed in the same process. And what I would argue for is an incremental approach, incremental in the sense that if two groups clash about what justice ought to look like, it's it's good to start with a modest approach where you start with small steps taking towards each other. With other words, that's why I spoke about fairness, which is in the eye of the beholder. The participants need to recognize the process that they're in as something that is fair, that is leading towards justice. So I do not believe in processes that are merely a cessation of hostility without any resolution of grievances that groups hold. And therefore, if a group sees no prospect of justice within a reconciliation process, they could participate cynically, or they could reject it out of hand, but in the end of the day, it will not lead to peace. So a peace process is only sustainable if justice is taken seriously, but it need not be absolute justice immediately. It could be incremental steps towards that, which is how I would define that. What kind of justice? I'm very aware that in many parts of the world, these paradigms of justice clash. I would simply say it needs to be justice that is recognized as such by those who are participating in that process. And therefore, it needs to be justice for them. I'm yet to see a group that does not value inclusion, and I'm yet to see a group that doesn't value fairness. Whether that comes with a whole full package of human rights as articulated in the United Nations and all that, maybe that's something that one can work out as the process proceeds, precisely what the take on this is. But to start with the value of inclusion, that we all have a voice at the table, and fairness, that what happens at the table should be fair to all of us as a basic modicum of progress, I think is sufficient to get a process going. And then it needs to be a progressively more inclusive and fairer process that comes from there. So I'm advocating, Professor Asano, a sort of incremental approach to justice, which is disciplined by the notions of inclusion and fairness, as in the eyes of the participants themselves firstly, but then gradually a larger community around that.
Thank you so much, Fanny. Yeah, thank you so much for your suggestive answers. Incremental approach and fairness, standard of fairness. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you both so much. So I don't see any other questions popping up. Does anyone else have any other questions in the last maybe 2 minutes or so that we could have one of the panelists respond to?
Martin is holding hand.
Martin, please go ahead.
So I would just have a question to continue this discussion on justice and reconciliation to Fanny. I think in every reconciliation process, people have different ideas what is justice. And I think we might think more about to create places and spaces where people are discussing between the different ideas of justice. For example, younger generations often have another interest and other ideas for justice than the older ones. And all this is relatively rarely addressed, really, and maybe in the long term a source of problems. You worked a lot on this topic, so I would like to ask you about. Fanny, du told.
Sorry, I couldn't find my unmute button there for a second. Yes, it's precisely because justice is not agreed upon that we need reconciliation as a means towards justice. Therefore, reconciliation is not a nice optional extra. It is the essential road towards justice. It is the shortest possible route to justice, is the dialogical process. It's precisely here also where I think sometimes the idea of justice as a law written in the sky that falls on our head and tell us how to live our lives is at odds with the dialogical incremental approach to justice, where people's dignity in the process is taken seriously, and they Justice is something that's born between adversaries in a conflict. I think the justice that lasts. One quick example is that when the white apartheid government came to the table, their idea of justice and what the ANC had as an idea of justice were very, very far apart. But it took 4 years of talking with each other before they had a joint framework for justice. So they did not come with they did come with their preset ideas, but they were able to compromise and to build a new unified concept of justice, which is the modern South Africa, the democratic South Africa as we see it, and which continues to guide us in times of bad times and in good times. We certainly need that at the moment. So I would simply say, yes, absolutely, Martin, fully agreed with your analysis, and that these conversations about justice and what it should entail is essential in constructing justice going forward.
So it seems like we're out of time here. We're, I think, 6 minutes past 11. So unfortunately, well, it doesn't seem like anyone else has any questions right now anyway. So I guess we'll close it out. Dr. Korostelina, do you want to?
Yes, thank you, Mike, thank you. Yeah, it's always, there is always, I tell, there is a structural violence in all these sessions, because you do your work for years, write multiple books, and then you have 10 minutes to speak about them. So that's why I know that I asked you to speak for 10 minutes, but your presentation was so wonderful and I didn't want to stop them. And we really learned so much from each other. And I completely see now that we probably need another session or another even conference on issue of justice and reconciliation. And let's work together and organize another event when we will actually very critically explore relationship between justice and reconciliation, as it interests so many people. Let's do it. So let's on this like a note, and I will send you email and we can set up some time to discuss about it, how we organize another event. Thank you everyone who takes their time and their opportunity to come here again. My apology for not giving you opportunity to ask questions, but presentation was so wonderful and didn't want to stop them. Thank you again for everyone, and we'll see you at another event. Thank you again. Thank you every presenter. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Karina.
Thank you so much.
And thank you everyone who be here.